Hello and a very warm welcome to today's webinar of EUA's Bologna webinar series towards the Bologna Process Ministerial Meeting, which will actually take place later this week. My name is Henriette Stöber. I'm a policy analyst at EUA's Higher Education Policy Unit, and I will be your moderator of the day. The focus of today's webinar is the social dimension of the Bologna process, and we will discuss the state of the art and the future, but also take a look at historical developments of the process. We scheduled this event quite fittingly on the 17th of November, because today is actually also the World Access to Higher Education Day. This is a global conference series, and I very much would invite you to have a look at their website, because there's quite a number of events and webinars going on the topic of access and social dimension in general around the world today. And I presume that also webinar recordings will be widely available at the World Access to Higher Education Day website. Before handing over to our speakers and introducing the webinar further, I would just like to give you a quick overview of the European University Association. We are a membership association currently bringing together around 800 higher education institutions in the countries of the Bologna process. You can see here our membership map, and this also includes 33 national level rectors' conferences and university associations. As an organization, we kind of have a double role. So on the one hand side, we bring together our members to discuss topics of importance to them in form of events, projects, and other activities. But on the other hand, we represent our members towards the policy level. So here in Brussels, towards the European Union, and also in the European higher education area. EUA is a consultative member of the Bologna process, and we have been active in most of the advisory groups, working groups, and task forces over the many years of the process, including the ones on the social dimension. So in the webinar today, we will take a three-section approach. First of all, we will have a bit of an introduction on the Bologna process, specifically with a focus on the current state of the art. And this will be done by Nino Schmidt, who was the co-chair of the BFUG advisory group on the social dimension in the last round of the Bologna process. He is also the executive director of the Institute for the Development of Education in Croatia. Hi, Nino. After this introductory section, we will go into a round of reflections, because Nino will actually introduce one of the key documents produced by the advisory group in the last couple of years, namely the principles and guidelines that you can find also under handouts on the right-hand side of your screen. We asked the following speakers to select two of the principles and reflect on them from the viewpoint of their institution or organization. So we will have reflections from our very own Anna-Lena Kleis-Kulik, who is a policy coordinator at EUA, and she will bring in the viewpoint of the higher education institutions. Anna Tecliace-Gorczyk will bring in the viewpoint from one of the member countries of the European higher education area. Anna is the head of sector for development of higher education at the Croatian Ministry of Science, Education and Sports. And last but not least, we will also hear the student viewpoint on two of the principles and guidelines. And this will be represented by Sebastian Berger, who is the vice president of the European Students' Union, ESO. After the reflection round, we will open the floor to discussions and also take questions from the audience with a particular view towards the future, so the next couple of years of making the social dimension a reality in all of the countries of the European higher education area. Now, before I hand over to Nino, I would just like to give the floor to my colleague Chiara, who will give us some information about the webinar tool that we're using and how you can participate interactively to our discussions. Chiara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henriette. Good afternoon, everyone. I will briefly go through some technical features with you. During this webinar, you have two ways of interacting with us. On your right-hand side, you will find three tabs called Chat, Q&A, and Handouts. The Chat tab is for greetings, technical questions, or any other comments on the webinar content. Then we have the Q&A tab. If you have content-related questions, use the Q&A tab. Here, you can ask questions to the speakers. It is a moderated box. One of our colleagues is going through your questions and publishing them. This Q&A box will be used to feed the discussions with our speaker, as Henriette said. The Handout tab There you can find some documentation from our speakers, documents that they would like to share with you all. The last point is that this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded on EUA's YouTube channel after the webinar. This concludes the technical features overview. Enjoy this webinar and over to you again, Henriette.
Great, thank you very much, Chiara. And I would just like to underline again, to make use of the Q&A section, we are very much looking forward to your questions, and I hope that we will manage to address as many as possible. I would now like to give the floor to Nino, and I would like to ask the other speakers to switch off their cameras. For the participants, if you have questions directly to Nino's presentation, please go ahead, and we will try to also address those in between the different presentations. Nino, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Henriette. At the beginning, I would like to thank EUA to organize this webinar, and I'm glad that I'm invited as a co-chair of the BFUG Advisory Group for Social Dimension, because I have been co-chairing this group in the past 2 years, and I'm glad that I'm able to present our main output, which is principles and guidelines to strengthen the social dimension of higher education in the European higher education area. But at the beginning, let me give you a brief historical background related to the social dimension, because this is relatively new policy area within the Bologna process. And it was mentioned for the first time in 2001 in the communique of ministers in Prague. And at that time, it was associated with the inclusion of underrepresented students in higher education. And from that time on, social dimension was always mentioned in the ministerial communiques. However, the understanding of social dimension was always different. In 2003, it was associated with the widening access to higher education, later with equitable access, and only in 2007 in London, ministers provided the first and complete definition of the social dimension, and they stressed that the composition of the student body entering, participating in, and completing higher education at all levels should correspond to the heterogeneous social profile of society at large. From that time, I could say that social dimension enhancement became one of the main goals of the Bologna process. And in 2009, ministers stressed the positive influence of widening participation and later of flexibility of entry routes on social dimension enhancement. In 2015, in Yerevan, ministers adopted for the first time strategy for social dimension until 2020, but already in 2018 in Paris, ministers recognized the need to guide member states on how to define and implement social dimension policy. So that was the reason why the Bologna Follow-Up Group established its advisory group for social dimension in 2018. I was nominated as a co-chair on behalf of Croatia, and I had a pleasure to co-chair the group with the president of the European Student Union, Robert Napier. And there were two main objectives for our advisory group. First one was to develop a common understanding of the concept of the social dimension. And the second objective was to develop a new strategic document, principles and guidelines that should help 48 countries to conceptualize their social dimension policies. So you see, the recognized importance for the social dimension in all key EHEA policy papers. In many EHEA countries, there are already measures in place to address the underrepresentation of particular societal groups in higher education. But these measures often create a set of isolated interventions and are not part of a coherent national strategy. Very few countries have developed national strategies or plans for fostering social dimension systematically. Therefore, I'm really glad that the Advisory Group for Social Dimension succeeded in creating a new forward-looking strategic document for the period 2020 to 2030, so for the upcoming decade. And I believe that this document represent a solution on the before-mentioned problems. So I'm glad to speak now more about the principles and the guidelines. The principles and guidelines take as a starting point the definition of the social dimension provided in the 2007 London communique, which I mentioned earlier. And this starting point embraces a social justice agenda because it enables creation of the policy levers for identifying and improving the prospects of underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable students. So the novelty of the principles and guidelines is that it goes beyond the London definition. So it has enlarged the definition of the social dimension by stressing that the social dimension encompasses the creation of an inclusive environment in higher education that fosters equity, diversity, and is responsive to the needs of local communities. So along with the element of inclusion, we have element of equity, diversity, and community engagement in higher education. So by moving beyond identifying underrepresented groups and moving beyond widening accessibility clauses and focusing on public good agenda, we believe that now public authorities and higher education institutions need to integrate the principles into the core higher education mission. So in learning and teaching, research and innovation, knowledge exchange and outreach, in the institutional governance and management, and in the policies for empowering both students and staff. So this new concept for the social dimension enabled us to create 10 principles for the social dimension for the upcoming 10 years. And we understand principles as high-level statements that serve as a basis for the conceptualization of different policies, while guidelines are recommendations intended to advise policymakers on how the principles should be implemented in practice. The novelty is also a glossary of terms at the end of the document with the definitions for underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable students. My colleagues will speak about the principles, but I would just like to highlight two principles. The first one, which says that the legal regulations and administrative rules should allow sufficient flexibility in organization and delivery of study programs to reflect the diversity of student needs. So you can see here clearly the need of integrating the principle into the learning and teaching. And maybe second, which stresses importance of community engagement, and that community engagement in higher education should promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, because such engagement provides a holistic basis on which universities can address a broad range of societal needs, including those of vulnerable, disadvantaged, and underrepresented groups, while enriching their teaching, research, and other core functions. So as a conclusion, I would say that principles and guidelines are not to be seen as a checklist, but as an instrument for developing fit for purpose, both national and institutional strategies and policies for social dimension enhancement. And I'm very glad that the first step in to start to implement principles and guidelines will be the adoption of the principles and guidelines by all 48 ministers of the EHEA at the EHEA Rome Ministerial Conference after tomorrow, so on Thursday. And the principles and guidelines will be an integral part of the ministerial communiqué, which is an excellent opportunity that the education ministers politically commit to its implementation. And we believe that it will enable concrete and tangible progress in fostering social dimension over the next decade. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nino, for this comprehensive overview, and congratulations also for the work that has been done in the last couple of years and the great document, the principles and guidelines that have been developed out of this group. We will talk a bit later today about how this will actually then be taken forward in the next round of the Bologna process. But I don't see any questions that are directly related to your presentation from the audience right now. So first, perhaps I would like to move on to the reflection round. You already mentioned it. We asked the following speakers to each select two of the principles and to reflect on them from the viewpoint of their organization or institution. So I would first like to invite Anna-Lena to give a reflection from the viewpoint of the higher education institutions based on a project that EUA has carried out on strategies for inclusion at higher education institutions. So Anna-Lena, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm very happy to contribute to the reflection on the principles and guidelines to strengthen the social dimension of higher education based on, as Henriette said, some selected results of EUA's invited projects. We've conducted this project on university strategies towards diversity, equity, and inclusion together with the European University Continuing Education Network and also with support of the European Students' Union. It ran from autumn 2018 to spring this year. And one of the main products is the publication of the results from a survey and follow-up interviews looking at institutional strategies towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the different approaches that universities across Europe have towards this. It also outlines some of the challenges as well as the opportunities and the measures that universities take towards this. The analysis is based on data from 159 higher education institutions from 36 European systems. And what is important to consider in this regard is that the sample has a certain self-select bias. This means we can assume that those institutions that responded to the survey also think that this is a very important topic and they actually have something to show on the topic. So those are most likely the ones that are more active on the topic. So we shouldn't, everything I say now in terms of the results, we shouldn't necessarily consider this as representative for what a university on average does in Europe with regard to diversity and equity and inclusion. This just as a sort of remark to give a bit of context to the further results. I've selected, as Henriette said, 2 principles from the Bologna principles. I would like to take the first one on strategies and then also principle 7 on support for higher education institutions. Principle 1 here, as you can read it on the slide, indicates that the social dimension should be central to higher education strategies, both at institutional but also at system level. So it indicates very much that this is a collective responsibility. The related guidelines recommend then the setting of concrete targets for widening access, for supporting participation, and also for establishing a broad-based inclusive dialogue with all the key actors to develop these strategies. And I would like to reflect on this now more from the institutional point of view and the point of view of our invited results. So the invited survey results show that a large majority of higher education institutions in our sample already have strategies in place that address diversity, equity, and inclusion questions, sometimes as an overarching strategy, but sometimes also with more specific focus. Most of the institutions in the sample have these strategies in place at central level. So they cover the entire university, but many also have them in place at lower levels within the institution, for example, at faculty or departmental level. Also, 85% of respondents indicated, with regard to another question that you do not see on the slide, that diversity, equity, and inclusion are explicit values of their institution, and that they see this very much as part of their social responsibility. About half of the institutions in the sample already have specific offices in place to implement the strategy, or also we can say to more broadly deal with a topic. But the capacities of such offices differ very, very much across Europe and across the different institutions. They can be, for instance, just one position within an entire institution, or it can also be a fully fledged diversity office. But the areas of responsibility are very different as well. And this is then also reflected in what we called in the survey the diversity dimensions. These are the aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion that the institutions look at in their strategies and that they have measures in place for. So we provided here a list based on certain personal characteristics, what we call the diversity dimension, but the respondents were very free to indicate other dimensions as well. And what you can here see on top of the list in the red square, the quite high percentages for most dimensions show that many of the responding institutions actually work on many different aspects of the topic. And they may put, some of them may put this together in an overarching strategy, but often it needs very different measures, expertise, and support within the institution. So it is a difference whether you actually focus on making your institution more accessible for people with disabilities, or catering towards the need of students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or actually tackling the topic of gender equality in research, just to give you some examples of the wide sort of range of things that we can understand as being part of the diversity question at institutions. When it comes to the measures that institutions have in place to address diversity, equity, and inclusion of students, we have distinguished three types of measures: outreach, access, and retention. And we can see that for reaching out to potential students, the collaboration with other educational institutions, so with schools, for instance, is a means that's used by many of the responding institutions. And it also hints already to the fact that inclusion cannot just start at higher education level, but actually needs to begin much before that. For access and retention, so for getting students from disadvantaged background and underrepresented backgrounds into higher education, and for helping them to successfully study, personal guidance, counseling, and mentoring are very important and are already in place in many of the institutions in our sample. The same counts for accessibility of infrastructure, but also accessibility, more broadly speaking, of learning environments, learning material, and methods. For staff, the measures regarding awareness raising as well as training are very important, notably for teaching staff. They rank here on top of the list of measures that many institutions already have in place, but as we can see on a later slide, when we more talk about the challenges, this is also what many still think they need to have more of. So when we relate this back to the Bologna Principle 1, we can see that, at least from our sample, many higher education institutions already have strategies and measures in place. But as I said before, these are the 159 institutions across Europe that are quite active on the topic. So it's not necessarily representative for all universities. When we now look more at what needs to be done from the side of public policies, so Bologna Principle 7 comes into play. And this says public authorities should help higher education institutions to strengthen their capacity in responding to the needs of a more diverse student and staff body, and create inclusive learning environments and inclusive institutional cultures. This is a very long sentence, but it's a quite important and very sort of rich sentence. And the first guideline already refers to support in an area that's very important for institutions, staff training. So this first guideline, I think, in the light of the invited results, is particularly important. In the invited survey, we have asked institutions about the remaining barriers to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And here I just want to focus on the light, the sort of the blue bar in the middle, which indicates the persisting challenges and barriers. As you can see here, the list is still quite long. About 2/3 indicate that as an existing barrier, the lack of funding, but also the lack of awareness as a barrier, followed by the difficulties to reach the target groups. And this is also very often related to difficulties or issues with regard to data collection and the use of data for the purpose of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is in many systems related to sort of on the one hand, legal questions with regard to data collection, but also the capacity of institutions to actually use in a sensible way the data they have on their students and staff towards measures for inclusion. And this also is linked very much to cultural differences in the whole questions around collection and use of data on personal characteristics, which is very common in systems like Ireland or the UK, for instance, but is difficult and not seen as appropriate, for instance, in parts in Germany and France, for instance, where the regulation around data collection on personal characteristics is much more strict. And also institutions don't necessarily want it because they see it as sort of putting people into boxes. So this is just outlining a few of the remaining barriers. Another one which also 53% indicate is still very important is the lack of information and training. We've then also asked institutions to indicate what further external support they would need to make progress with regard to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there, unsurprisingly, funding comes up. The need for additional funding is very high by more than 2/3 of respondents, and also the need for additional staff training opportunities and special grants for students from disadvantaged and less represented groups. So what I just want to say to conclude is, on the one hand, we can see from Invited, there are many institutions that already address this. They see this as their priority and as an important contribution and responsibility with regard to society, but there are still quite a number of challenges linked to that. So the principles and guidelines that are now adopted in the context of the Bologna process are very important to, also from an institutional point of view, to guide this process of further reflection and also system and institution level reforms in this regard. Thank you very much. These were my slides.
Thank you very much, Annalena, for bringing in the viewpoint from the higher education institutions. I see here that there's a couple of questions that are related to the ESGs and quality assurance. Whilst I know that you would also have comments on this, I think also the other speakers would have points to say on this. So perhaps we put a note and leave it for the discussion round and make one of the questions around this topic. And I would then now hand over to Anna Teciaci-Gorczyk to present us the viewpoint from EHEA member country, namely Croatia, and she will reflect also on two of the principles and guidelines, namely number 3 and 4. So Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Henriette, and thank you very much for inviting me today to share my reflections and some experience from the perspective of a ministry, and also some information on developments on social dimension in higher education in Croatia. So let me first start with some more general remarks on development of social dimension in higher education in Croatia that has long been among our policy objectives. We were inspired by the developments at the European level, and in particular with the adoption of widening access strategy at the ministerial conference in Yerevan in 2015. It was kind of pushed towards national policy developments, and in the same year we established the National Group for Enhancing the Social Dimension of Higher Education. And the aim of the group was to develop a comprehensive approach to enhancing social dimension in higher education. However, I think it is important to say and emphasize that access is not inclusion. So it's not sufficient to take care of enlarging and widening access in order to have inclusive policies. And it is important to emphasize that addressing the obstacles faced by the students, and in particular those students that are part of vulnerable groups, that implies that equality of opportunities in higher education cannot be reduced solely to providing formal access to higher education. And we decided to take a comprehensive approach that would include access to quality higher education, but also ensuring timely progression through study years and raising completion rates, with improving, in the end, employability of graduates. And we started with looking at the two most striking challenges that we had and we still have in Croatia. And the first one was and is to increase the number of people with tertiary education. When looking at numbers, and according to the most recent data, in Croatia there is around 33% of tertiary education attainment of those of age 30 to 36. And this is comparable with the EU average, which is 40%, which was also the target of Europe 2020. And looking at the target for European education area, which is 50% by 2030, our challenge becomes even bigger. And the second challenge was, and still is, to achieve the shared aspiration that student body reflects the body of the overall population. And that's why we started to work on and finally adopted the National Plan for Enhancing the Social Dimension of Higher Education, and it was in 2019. And this national plan presents a comprehensive set of policy measures that are related directly or indirectly to social dimension in higher education. The national plan identified 18 underrepresented and vulnerable groups of students and defined some specific characteristics of these groups. And the objective was to develop an integral system for monitoring enrollment, progression, and completion, in particular of those students that come from underrepresented and vulnerable groups. And finally, a study on underrepresented and vulnerable groups of students has been just finalized by the Institute for Social Research in Zagreb, and it is soon to be published. And this study gives the author's contribution to the enhancement of social dimension of higher education in Croatia, and it analyzes success and completion of underrepresented and vulnerable groups in higher education, and also determines factors that contribute to the low inclusion of those students from these groups. And that brings me to the principle number 3 that I have been invited to reflect on, which is the inclusiveness of the entire education system should be improved by developing coherent policies from early childhood education through schooling to higher education and throughout lifelong learning. So our approach was indeed comprehensive, and it does include the different levels of education from early childhood, primary, secondary, to higher education and lifelong learning. And this is, I believe, very important because inequalities of opportunities are created in early childhood. Sometimes higher education is too late to address these inequalities and to make an impact and a significant change. So we decided to work on policy measures that would widen participation in higher education, so to increase the pool of potential students to higher education. Again, looking at numbers, statistics in Croatia, one of the challenges is that we have quite low enrollment in early childhood education. That is around 81%, comparing to the EU average of around 95%. And looking also at the target of European education area of 98%. So there is room for improving, let's say like that. And secondly, one of the challenges is also that we have a relatively high proportion of 15-year-olds underachievers in basic competencies. And this again also decreases the pool of potential students because basic competencies are relevant for higher education. And third characteristic is that we have quite a big number of students enrolled in VET, vocational education, secondary education, around 70%. So in order to plan reforms that would increase the number of higher education graduates, we launched several different policy measures that would be concentrating on increasing proportion of children in early childhood education and improving the teaching and learning conditions in general education, and all to increase the pool of potential students to higher education. Secondly, we have set the plans to further developments towards more flexible learning pathways into higher education. For example, for adults who decide to return or to enter higher education at later stage in their lives. So for the moment, looking again at the numbers in Croatia, according to the most recent Eurostudent data, most dominant education path is to enter higher education when having finished high school. The Eurostudent data show that 73% of students in Croatia are under 25 years of age, which is comparing to the average of 63% in other Eurostudent countries, quite high. So the policy measures that we plan in the next period include in particular attracting more those non-traditional students to higher education, and by promoting the idea of recognition of prior learning as a way to access higher education. As Principle 4 is concerned, and it involves good quality data, that reliable data is necessary precondition for an evidence-based improvement of social dimension of higher education. Higher education systems should define the purpose and goals of collecting certain types of data, taking into account the particularities of the national legal frameworks. Adequate capacities to collect, process, and use such data to inform and support the social dimension of higher education should be developed. So one of the first objectives in our national plan for enhancing social dimension in higher education is in particular the creation of reliable data that would allow for systematic data collection, monitoring, research, and evaluation for evidence-based policy making. And I must say that the new rules set by the GDPR were not very helpful in that respect. And it is still challenging to set a national data collection which would be useful for evidence-based policy making and as well at the same time be in line with the GDPR. So we envisage to introduce certain legislative changes, and we are still working and discussing how to make them so that we can have at national level comparable data that would also be comparable at the international level. And secondly, we also, for some years already now, participate in Eurostudent surveys. And I think that this participation in Eurostudent is very much useful in order to understand better different aspects of studying and students' population. And complementary to Eurostudent research, we also have been carrying out some additional research and analysis, such the study I mentioned before, that aims in particular at better understanding vulnerability, disadvantages, and underrepresentation in higher education. So, for example, the results of Eurostudent as well as this additional research demonstrated that the perspective of higher education is unequal for various vulnerable groups, and that living and studying conditions may have significant negative influence on the experience of studying. So in order to improve inclusion in higher education, and in particular for individuals from different socioeconomic backgrounds, we increased investments in scholarships for students with lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And secondly, the other field that we are working on is accommodation. So the research results show that living and studying conditions are affected by students' accommodation because accommodation costs are the largest item in students' overall cost. And comparing again data from Croatia with other Eurostudent country, only 9% of students in Croatia live in dormitories. And comparing to the Eurostudent average is 20%. So this is very much important since the current system for subsidizing accommodation in Croatia is socially sensitive. That means that socioeconomic status of students is taken into consideration when awarding places in student dormitories. And therefore, for the upcoming period, we plan additional infrastructural investments, and in particular, aiming at increasing capacities of existing dormitories following renovation and adaptation. And this is being proposed under the National Recovery and Resilience Program that will use the opportunity to tackle the issue of social dimension in that respect. So this was a brief overview of our comprehensive approach to social dimension and some examples related to these two principles. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Anna, for this comprehensive overview indeed, and also for mentioning, external resources and hinting at what other countries might find useful, such as the Eurostudents survey for data collection and so on and so forth. I don't see a question directly related to your presentation, but there is a comment which we perhaps can change into a question. One of the participants comments that higher education is not too late, even if changes have to start in early childhood education, because in higher education we can address future childhood educators, therefore hinting at learning and teaching, a curricula for teacher training and so on and so forth. Is this a topic that is addressed by the strategies and activities taken by your ministry?
Well, when it comes to study programs, I might say that in Croatia, universities are quite autonomous and they design their study programs and they are responsible for all academic aspects. What is a part of our comprehensive strategy is actually to increase the number of early childhood educators and trainers, because this is also where we have a lack of competent persons working in those kindergartens that we want to use in order to increase the participation of children. So in that respect, we have some incentives and measures that would allow for competent persons working in kindergartens. But when it comes to design of curriculum, this is really something completely up to higher education institutions that we hope are in line with contemporary developments.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much. And I think I would now like to hand over to our next speaker, the last point under the reflection round. Sebastian will give us the viewpoint from the European Student Union, also on 2 select principles. So Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Henriette. Let me start with expressing my gratitude for the chance to be here today. It's an honor to speak in this forum, and I'm happy to give you a bit on principles and guidelines 5 and 8, circling around counseling and guidance, as well as as some of you know, the social dimension of higher education and the BFUG Advisory Group 1 specifically have always been, and especially in the last year, at the heart of ESO's policy and efforts. And as Henriette and Robert Napier had the pleasure to co-chair this HE with Ninoslav, and I think everyone involved can be really proud of the outcomes crystallized in the principles and guidelines as they stand. I personally was not a member of the HE, but I will to give you an idea of the considerations from a student's perspective. Principle 5 stipulates that authorities should enable institutions to effective counseling and guidance for potential and enrolled students. It calls for coherence across education and directs specific attention towards the transitional phases between educational sectors, and especially comes to the departure into the labor markets. And from the perspective of the European student, we see this crucial to not only focus on students who have already succeeded in entering higher education, but to focus on providing support and accessible information, especially to those who are yet to graduate from secondary education. These early stage interventions are key and a mechanism to achieve the goal of widening access and participation in higher education. And we speak about things like guidance programs, academic goal setting, tutoring, very much first year programs, learning communities, and other such should support students upon entering higher education, help them in their individual pathways to completion. We see it also as crucial that public institutions cooperate with higher education institutions when providing these services. Accurate guidance and information will lead to students being able to choose what type of higher education as well as what program would suit them. Those responsible for delivering student guidance should have the body trained accordingly in order to ensure that their services are adequate for the needs of a very much diverse students population. From a student's perspective, we also very much welcome the guideline B, addressing the need of increase for students with physical and psychological health challenges. We believe that we need a balance from reacting to acting to mental health challenges, and prevention is a key element in this regard, especially when we take into account the implications of the crisis on the mental health of students. It is very much evident that more and more students suffer from mental health problems, consequence of the ongoing pandemic and all over Europe. And one of the problems that we see is that to this day, the stigma remains arguably the most. Henriette, you want?
I'm sorry for interrupting, Sebastian. There seems to be issues with your sound.
Okay.
I can hear you okay, but perhaps you could switch off your camera so to enhance the sound a little bit. There's always a little bit of a time lag. Apologies for interrupting. And please continue. I think maybe without camera, it might work better. Thank you.
Okay, so sorry for that. My internet seems to be a bit problematic. Can you hear me well now?
I think it's better. Thank you.
Yes, better.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. I don't know where you lost me, Henriette. Can you give me a bit of an idea where I started to?
No, we didn't lose you, but it was a bit patchy. But we could hear the main points well, I think. If you can just continue on your current point. Thank you.
Very good, very good. Yeah, I think we were stopping at mental health and the social stigma that students are facing when it's basically coming to a point where they search for help and access support for mental health difficulties. And we must engage in actively breaking down this stigma surrounding mental health in order to ensure that those who need feel comfortable reaching out, ultimately improving the accessibility of mental health support services. With regards to Guideline C, we very much see the importance of establishing ombudspersons to uphold students' rights and help with guidance when students' rights are being infringed. Although this is in place in some countries, ESO finds it crucial to establish an independent body to do so across all EHEA member states. With the next slide, we move on to Principle 8, diverse, equitable, and inclusive mobility for students and staff. We firmly believe that the Erasmus Plus program and other mobility schemes need to benefit the many and not only the few. Increased accessibility and focus on creating an inclusive program need to be at the heart of all policy considerations, and international mobility needs to be accessible for a larger group of beneficiaries from all ages and from all parts of society, especially from disadvantaged groups who still struggle evidently to access and be successful in the current program, looking at Erasmus. Reflecting on Guideline A, we identify as a major barrier for removing the obstacles some groups are facing when it comes to accessing learning mobility as the lack of compatible information about the hurdles that students are facing. It would be very helpful to have a joint effort across Europe to gather information on locally defined minorities in each education system, as well as the barriers to participation in mobility that they are facing in their respective contexts. Another measure we see as key is the provision of clear information on accessibility of institutions and facilities, as well as student supports and help services through standards and guidelines for the accessibility of those educational institutions who wish to take part in learning mobility. In the short term, we see this as a potentially soft tool for helping institutions to improve accessibility. And in the longer perspective, we see it as a potential harder tool aimed at making mobility, at least under the Erasmus Plus framework, more inclusive by setting these conditions for institutions to take part in the program. Guideline B addresses the role of blended mobility and internationalization from home as a means to attract a more diverse group of participants to take part in mobility. And as ESU, despite COVID-19 and the digitalization of the way we teach and learn, we hold on to the idea that blended mobility and internationalization from home, or virtual mobility as it is called by many, which we very much disagree, can never be replacing physical mobility, and efforts need to be aimed at making physical mobility more inclusive instead of creating a discount version of mobility for those who we fail to successfully integrate in the real deal, which is still physical mobility. However, we very much acknowledge, of course, the necessity of both forms as a bridging tool till physical mobility is restored once health experts decides that it is safe to do so. I hope you heard me well in the at least later part of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. No, we heard you very well indeed, and perhaps it was just a temporary issue with the connection there. Thanks a lot for presenting the viewpoints of ESU to two of the principles and guidelines, and also hinting at some of the work that you are carrying out currently in your projects. I am very sure that probably all the speakers agree to most of the points you have said, and perhaps we can also pick some of them up, for instance, with regards to mobility and so on in the discussion rounds that follow. Now, let me just quickly see if there is any direct questions to your presentation. Okay, I think these are all more general comments and questions, and we can pick them up in the discussion round, which I would like to now open. And I would like to ask all the speakers to turn on their cameras, and if we can switch on and off the microphones to enhance the connection as we go. Let's see how that works. Before opening the floor for the questions from the audience, I would actually just like to briefly set the scene myself. As I had promised at the beginning of the webinar, in this discussion round, we would like to focus specifically on the future, so on the next steps for the social dimension in the Bologna process. Nino has mentioned or given us quite a good overview of the many steps already taken in the discussions in the European higher education area, I think starting with 2001, if I remember correctly. But we also know from the Bologna implementation reports, for instance, that even though the discussion have been ongoing and there have been recommendations for strategies and so on and so forth, not many countries have been as active and successful as, for instance, Croatia, in actually implementing comprehensive and overarching strategies for the social dimension in higher education. So my first question for the speakers or for the general discussion would be, how do we make it a success story in the next years of the Bologna process? And I would first like to give the floor to Nino to perhaps give us an overview of what is actually planned. You already gave some hints in your introduction, but perhaps you can go into more detail for the next round of the Bologna process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Henriette. Exactly. Our advisory group has proposed to the Bologna Follow-Up Group to establish the new group for the period 21 to 24. So the new advisory group on the social dimension. And we proposed two main objectives for this new group. And the first one would be developing indicators and benchmarks for the principles included in the principles and guidelines, in the current principles and guidelines. And second objective would be developing a system of monitoring the implementation of the principles and guidelines. And I think that the first step for public authorities in the implementation of the principles and guidelines should be offering a legal, financial, administrative, and informative framework that can initiate process of the implementation at the local level. Henriette?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So you mentioned monitoring. So this will indeed also link into the ongoing monitoring efforts of the Bologna process. And again, I would like to remind of the Bologna implementation report that is published with each round of the process. I would like to hand over now to Anna, also reflecting on the next steps that will be taken in your country, and perhaps maybe give us some lessons learned or perhaps hints for other countries and ministries on how to take this forward in their own system when they're just beginning the journey of implementing activities for social dimension.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. And I will also try to address the question that I've seen in the chat box directed to the ministry in Croatia. And so when looking for at future steps and what can we do, I think that what I emphasize in my presentation, a comprehensive approach is very much important. So because social dimension is so interdimensional, and it addresses and tackles different issues and different policy areas. So I really think that there is a need for interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral approach to developing social dimension in general. And when looking at the role of the institutions, that was from the question from the chat box, I think that institutions are very much aware of their role, and the principles and guidelines that have been developed are excellent tools, in particular for the institutions, for the ministries as well, but also for the institutions. And what can we do in our joint endeavors, let's say like that? I think that as was said in the presentation of Anna-Lena, I think that raising awareness is important, and institutions feel that as well. So there are many activities that we can do in order to put these topics on the agenda of our discussions, of our roundtables, our seminars, webinars, whatever we have, and also sharing experience among institutions themselves. So in the Bologna process, we have had quite interesting and useful experience from the peer learning approach that was implemented in other areas, three key commitments: qualifications framework, quality assurance, and recognition of qualifications. And there were ideas and proposals that this peer approach is taken forward to other policy areas, such as social dimension. And I think that can be very useful at the European level in order to share experience among peers, among the ministries, but also among institutions, but as well as the national level, because this peer approach is quite fruitful, because sometimes when working and discussing jointly, we can come up with some ideas that otherwise would be more difficult. So I think we could work on that. And of course, the data collection and data publishing, because if we have some research and we just publish the results of our research, it can also be stimulating to improve institutional policies as well as national policies. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. And I think this also nicely then would lead over to invite some comments from Anna-Lena from the institutional perspective.
Yes, so thank you very much, Henriette. And I actually can echo much of what Anna just said, because what I think is important for the future is really what the principles and guidelines also emphasize is an inclusive dialogue on the policies, but also the concrete need for sort of removing systemic barriers, not only at the level of individual universities and institutions, but also within the education and higher education systems. And what I still remember very much of the discussions that we also had in the advisory group 1 is that when it comes to wanting to see sort of how institutions perform with regard to inclusion, diversity, there is very much often the idea you would need to measure the performance of institutions with regard to this, and that's done in some systems. But from EUA's point of view, I think what we've tried also with the invited project to do is to emphasize indeed more this exchange and peer learning and an open and dialogue about it, rather than measures that want a quick fix, like, you know, a stick and carrot approach. Sort of you measure institutions on their performance with regard to inclusion without looking at the wider system level barriers, and that we would warn against. So I think what we really need is this dialogue, and the principles and guidelines can be an important tool for this, but it needs to be specific. This dialogue needs to take place at national and at local level with all the right stakeholders, not only universities and policymakers, but students, potential students, people who and groups who represent underrepresented and disadvantaged people as well, and the wider community. So this, I would say, is very important. And then, yes, it's support to the institutions for information, staff training, and all of this, that the university teachers, researchers, students are actually enabled to and have the knowledge to actually embrace diversity rather than seeing it as a challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, you already mentioned it. It is very important to have this dialogue involving all types of stakeholders, including students. And I would like to also open the question on what is needed for the future, linked to this to Sebastian. Would you like to perhaps emphasize different points? Do you agree to what has been said so far?
I agree to what has been said by the colleagues, and And like if you look at what the question and what Nino has been doing in the EHEA, Henriette, you look as I'm lacking again. Can you hear me? Now.
Sorry, yes,
Can you hear
it's a bit patchy. I think without camera might be better.
All right, I'm really sorry for that. Usually it works. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. Sorry about that.
No problem. I just wanted to basically follow up on what the previous speaker said. Very much agree in general terms, but I'm also going to take the privilege of speaking from a student's perspective to be a bit bolder and less technical. I believe that commitments on the European level mean little to nothing if member countries and institutions do not implement the measures. And the principles and guidelines represent for sure a window of opportunity to bridge the gap between policy and practice. But if we want to be successful, we talk about money. We talk about reducing the direct and indirect costs of studies. We need to sufficiently fund higher education and combat tuition fees. We need to move to the provision of grants that cover the full living expenses of students. And it's also important, as Anna said, to help bearing the indirect costs, such as housing and transport. With COVID-19 and the pandemic, we need to invest funds into providing mental health counseling and support to those who need it. And this is frankly a decision that governments have to take and live with the consequences. Either you invest in social mobility or you don't. That is the key point.
Absolutely, thank you. Absolutely. Thank you very much for those comments. And you link also to a point that is also coming up in the Q&A. So let's move on to this one then. COVID-19, and one of the participants here asked also about it, the current crisis facing higher education. We don't really know what is going to come in the following years in terms of structures, developments, funding available, and so on and so forth. The question here refers also to the need for leveling up on digital skills. So, other priorities that might be there on the policy level in addition to the social dimension. With regards to COVID-19, do you think is this an opportunity, or is this perhaps a challenge to making the social dimension a reality in the future of the European higher education area? And I would just like to invite anyone's comments by show of hand. Yes, Nino, please.
I think that current digital environment could widen access and participation for different groups of students. But at the same time, we've seen in the current survey on student life during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown performed by researchers at the University of Zadar, and then together with the ESU and the Institute for the Development of Education and Croatian Ministry for Education and Science, we've seen that almost 40% of students lost permanently or temporarily their jobs. So we know that on average, almost 60% of students in Euro student countries work along studies. And they work because they need to cover their study costs and their costs for living. And the fact that almost 40 or more than 40% of them lost their income through jobs, I think that it certainly represents a big problem for underrepresented, disadvantaged, and vulnerable students. So I would say that these new circumstances definitely represent also a challenge for social dimension in general. Henriette?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nino. Would one of the other speakers like to comment? Anna, please.
Yes, I fully agree that this situation is challenging even more the social dimension, because the challenges are much higher for those from underrepresented and vulnerable groups. They often, not only financial issue is important, but also accessibility to different education resources, in particular when we have distance learning and remote education at a large scale, it's not very easy for the students to have, for all the students, and in particular those that are vulnerable, to have access to good quality resources, digital resources. So I think that in future, what we will really have to take care of is investing in making it accessible for all students at all different areas. And students are going back into their homes if they are studying in bigger university towns, and with closing down the institutions, they tend to go back at their homes, and not necessarily they have conditions for learning, for studying in their homes. So there will be, we will need to be flexible and creative in the measures that we will be setting in front of us. That's what I believe.
Yes, thank you, Anna, for this important viewpoint. Would Sebastian or Annalena like to comment as well? COVID-19 challenge or opportunity for the social dimension? Annalena, please.
Yes, I think it's both, like Nino and Anna said before. It's a huge challenge, but it's also an opportunity in the sense that I think we have to just think the social dimension, as Anna said before, very much as a transversal sort of issue. And while we speak about digitalization in higher education, for instance, also questions of sustainability, the green transition, all the big topics also for society and for higher education, we have to think the social dimension into that always. And the current crisis, I think, as with many challenges, is just exacerbating many of the social issues that we see, and that will also reflect is also reflected in higher education. So I think the principles and guidelines now, as they sort of open up the next Bologna round and the discussions about the implementation, will be actually very important to make these issues visible, also sort of in tackling the current crisis. And then we talk about recovery. I mean, Anna also mentioned that Croatia wants to use some of the recovery funds from EU level for actually addressing the social dimension. And I think that's a practical way of which is actually, which shows how important this is. And we shouldn't forget about the social problems and the social dimension of higher education, because we think there are still some other emergencies sort of to tackle first, but they have to very much be thought into the solution and the recovery also at institutional level.
Great, thank you very much, Annalena. As I can't see Sebastian, I don't know if you would also like to comment on this.
Yes, very quickly. I can only support what the previous speakers were saying, but I think it's important to really make ourselves understand that COVID-19 represents the second big crisis my generation, the generation of people who are studying at the moment, is living through after the post-2008 economic turmoil. And in too many countries, students have been forgotten in the measures to mitigate the impact of the crisis, economically speaking, while businesses and big industry receive generous financial compensations. And that hits especially those who already had a precarious lifestyle, who already had to work part-time jobs to keep afloat. And this is not the only thing I want to address. Also from the institutional side, while we have a huge spike in poverty within the students' body, institutions in some countries in Europe and anyhow in the US are charging tens of thousands of euros for homeschooling, while many students really don't have enough money anymore to pay their food or their heating. So we need a paradigm shift in how we see this crisis, and I think we have to be frank in addressing how bad the situation really is, because it is bad on the ground. People are suffering. That's my 2 cents to this.
Very good. Thank you also for this important viewpoint. Looking at the chat questions, perhaps before we close the webinar, I would just like to go back to a question that has partially been answered, but raised by two speakers. So maybe we can invite some more comments. There were two questions related, Lucy, to quality assurance. One of them about the link to the European standards and guidelines. And I know this was one of the aspects also discussed in the previous advisory group. And another one on how external quality assurance has arrived, so to say, in the guidelines, and if the participants could explain more on the idea behind it. And again, I would invite comments by show of hand. Or give the floor to Nino and Annalena, who have been involved in the discussions. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Henriette. Exactly. The principle number 7 in the guidelines. So the principle number 7 says that the public authorities should help higher education institutions to strengthen their capacity in responding to the needs of a diverse student body and to create inclusive learning environment. And we envisaged under the guidelines that external quality assurance system should address how the social dimension, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion are reflected with the institutional missions of higher education institutions. And I just participated at one round table just before this webinar. It was at the University of EHEA. And the rector of the university said that they would really consider improving their internal quality systems in a way that internal quality systems somehow monitors social dimension implementation at the university level. And they said that they would also like that the external quality element, so the agency, that it also through accreditation or re-accreditation and other procedures, that they also somehow examine how the social dimension is implemented within the university. So I think that the quality assurance could be helpful, but it's always context specific, I think. And always universities need to decide for themselves whether they would like to foster the social dimension in that way or not. So there is not one solution for all the university. It is always context specific. Henriette?
Very good. Thank you very much, Nino, also for the concluding sentence of institutions and whether they should decide to take this approach or not. Is there any comments on this topic from other speakers? Again, by show of hands, no? Okay, well then I think all that remains for me to do, as we are running out of time allocated for this webinar, is to show you the last slide of my PowerPoints. If we could get those up, please. And of course, thank all the speakers for participating, and also the participants for asking questions and participating in this webinar as well. We already mentioned that there will be a recording, and you will also receive all the materials in a follow-up email. As a last point here, I would like to do some promoting. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar is part of an EUA webinar series towards the Bologna Ministerial Conference, and actually we have one more in the series upcoming, which is after, not towards the Bologna Ministerial Conference. We will host a webinar on 1st of December where university leaders will discuss the ministerial communique that the ministers are to sign Thursday this week. This webinar is open to EUA members only, and they will or have already received an invitation to this event where leadership and EUA representatives will discuss the outcomes of the community, give some feedbacks from their viewpoints, and also discuss visions for the future of the process. So again, thank you very much for your contributions, everyone, and I hope for the participants that this event was informative, and we're looking forward to seeing you in another online or perhaps even face-to-face event in the future. And we are looking forward to your feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.